Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of The Best Games Period. We had something planned for this week, but plans sometimes fall through. And so this week, I'm going to be doing another honorable mention, the second in a row. This one is going to be about Dragon's Dogma. I figured with the recent release of Shadow of the Colossus Remastered on PlayStation 4, what better game to do than, since we already did Shadow of the Colossus, what better game to do than Dragon's Dogma, which, even though it released 7 years after Shadow of the Colossus, Dragon's Dogma has received a lot of comparisons to Shadow of the Colossus, among a lot of other things like Dark Souls or even Monster Hunter a little bit, which makes sense because there is kind of a Dark Souls-y vibe to the world, and there are a lot of monsters to hunt. In fact, the entire game kind of revolves around Monster Hunter-like activities, and it's made by Capcom, who I believe also make Monster Hunter, so there's a lot of overlap going on here. The main reason it gets comparisons to Shadow of the Colossus, by the way, if you've never played Dragon's Dogma, is you have the ability to actually grab onto, or you can grab smaller human-sized monsters and kind of like hold them in like a grapple, or if something's larger than human-sized, you can actually climb onto them and climb up to their heads or their weak points and get more advantageous, critical hits. That's how you get critical hits. You hit the weak points, and usually if you're playing a melee character, that involves climbing onto them and hewing away at their fleshy bits, as it were. And so like I said, Dragon's Dogma came out in 2012, which you might recognize as being a fairly long time ago, 6 years. And it actually received quite a warm welcome. It was a new IP, unproven. People didn't really know what to expect, but I think it kind of hit at a sweet spot where people really did want more Dark Souls stuff, and there wasn't a whole lot out there in terms of Dark Souls-like stuff that it scratched that itch. And part of the reason it kind of gets compared to Dark Souls is, besides the fact that it kind of has this fantasy world that has a dark edge to it, it's also unforgiving. And what I mean by that is it's not unfair. Dragon's Dogma is actually I think, pretty fair in how its difficulty is dispersed. Basically, there's a lot of, you need to start at point A and go to point B. And at least in the original release of Dragon's Dogma, there wasn't any. There was fast travel, but you had to play through most of the game to actually get to the point where you can fast travel. And that forced you, as a player, to use the roads. And part of the interesting thing about that is if you didn't use the roads, if you decided, I'm going to be a hero and I'm going to go off into the woods and fight some monsters, those monsters were going to mess you up. You were very likely not coming back from those woods. And it gave the world this very real sense of danger. And you understood why people were afraid of monsters. You understood that if you weren't a really strong fighter, you were probably not coming back from that trip to the woods. And it also added to this sense of progression, because you could use the roads freely, but you couldn't find all the secrets. And so eventually you'd get stronger, you'd go back to those initial starting areas, and you'd be able to explore all of the woods eventually. You'd be able to go through that mountain range you couldn't go through before. You'd be able to, fight those bandits that you couldn't reach before because there were high-level monsters in the way. And so I think that's kind of why it got a lot of comparisons to Dark Souls when it came out. And the fighting was hard. And I think that I feel like I'm praising Dragon's Dogma a lot, and that's because it is kind of this cult fringe hit. And it certainly has its problems. That's kind of why I decided it would be good as an honorable mention. For example, the difficulty curve in Dragon's Dogma is unsatisfying towards the late game. I think that's why they eventually released an expansion called Dark Arisen for Dragon's Dogma. And Dark Arisen essentially adds this whole end game dungeon, this island that you can explore and fight high level monsters and kind of get better gear and all that stuff. Because basically, when you finish Dragon's Dogma the first time, there wasn't a whole lot of incentive to keep playing. Like you'd finish the game, and that was it. I haven't really talked about the story that much yet. And that's because Dragon's Dogma is not terribly interested in telling a story. Even though it has, at its core, a very interesting premise and interesting ideas as to what it wants its story to be about, too. The initial setup is that you play as this knight named Savon, who is an Arisen, who is a hero chosen to defeat the dragon that comes to end the world periodically. And Savon goes and he fights this chimera in kind of the introductory scene of the game. And then it switches to a couple centuries later, and the dragon's back again. And you play as a character you create who never talks, and that character is just kind of a fishing country bumpkin who takes up a sword to try and defend their fishing village against this dragon. The dragon totally owns them, and then while they're kind of defenseless and dazed on the ground, the dragon takes a claw and gouges out their heart. But using some kind of magic that is never really explained, the dragon, instead of killing you, the dragon eats your heart and then lays forth this challenge. You have 1 year to kind of prepare, and then you can come and try and get your heart from the dragon. Otherwise, he'll own your soul or something along those lines. So, it's as far as setups go, that's pretty compelling. Then the dragon flies off and just kind of leaves you almost dead on the beach. And everyone around you is just kind of like, oh, that's weird. They don't have a heart anymore. Like, I can't hear a heartbeat, but they're still alive. That's weird. So you take off on this epic quest, and along the way you encounter these creatures called pawns. And pawns are these weird... They're intelligent, but they're not... They're described in a way that seemingly implies that they're not sentient. They have no free will. But they're humans that are really good at fighting, and they know stuff, and they answer to Arisen characters. And your character, by having its heart eaten by the dragon, has become an Arisen, and it's a deferential title. And so you travel around the world with between 1 to 3 of these AI pawn companions who they shout out different strategies with how to deal with the various monsters you encounter, or different pathways through woods or environments, and they're actually surprisingly helpful until late game when you know all the stuff that they're yelling at you, and then it just kind of gets really irritating. But even so, there's an interesting online element to them too, because each player who undertakes the journey of Dragon's Dogma actually makes their own pawn, and that pawn is with them from the start of the game to the end of the game. And the other 2 pawns are either pawns that were created by the developers of the game and put in case you were playing offline, or they are other player pawns that were created and have been sent off into the ether to perform quests. So often you will be encountering and adventuring with these pawns that were made by other players, and that's kind of an interesting thing, and I don't think I've ever seen any other game do something like that. I'm not sure that it's really 100% compelling, but I do find it interesting. And it works rather well. And I believe that when your pawn is chosen to adventure in other people's worlds, it comes back with gifts from those other players that it adventured with. So there's kind of an interesting reward dynamic to that as well. And the character creation. Oh boy, the character creation. Okay. So a lot of games let you make characters that are within a certain range of body types. Which, granted, I'm always excited to kind of see what kinds of characters people can create. I think Dragon's Dogma has one of the largest range of body types and kinds of characters that you can make, and a lot of them are default. Like you have the option when you make your character to kind of scroll through a large variety of these characters, and you literally, like, you can have overweight characters, you can have beefy characters, you can have skinny characters, you can have elderly characters, you can have anything you kind of human you can imagine, you can probably make that character in Dragon's Dogma. One of the I don't know why this stands out to me, but one of the characters that is default, one of the default options is an elderly brown-skinned woman who's bald and literally has a bent back, looks like she should be using a cane. And that's really interesting to me. You don't ever see that in games, especially not an action game. That character becoming a sword-wielding knight is really interesting to me. And I think it's something more games should kind of look at and take note of, because there are certainly other people in the world besides me who would find that kind of an adventure really interesting and different. And I think a lot of games these days could benefit from being different. And not different in a, we can shoot people in a slightly different way, or we can chop people up in a slightly different way. No, but being a different character, especially in a game that is all about making your own character and kind of forging your own destiny. And that kind of brings me to the second half of Dragon's Dogma. Dragon's Dogma's story, which is that the game does not end with you killing the dragon. That actually happens about halfway through, and then you have to kind of deal with the fallout of killing this dragon. What does it mean to kill this being that is supposedly eternal? And the fallout eventually leads you to becoming kind of the ruler of this particular reality. And you find out that there are, hundreds, millions, countless other realities out there that are each ruled by their own overseer. And you kind of have this option of do you want to have this role? You'll have to give up everything, but you will have unspeakable power. Or you can give it all up. And it presents some really interesting choices. And part of the problem is, and one of the things that I think makes that kind of that final choice not land 100% well, is that there aren't a ton of really compelling, interesting characters in Dragon's Dogma. There are also some really ill-defined systems at work that determine, for example, who your love interest is. Who your love interest is, I believe, is determined by which NPC you talk with the most in the game. So you had, when this game came out, a bunch of hilarious stories about people, falling in love, or with random NPCs they had completely forgotten about. And that's interesting and a novel concept, but a little bit more transparency in that regard would probably be good. And these are little things that I think add up to making Dragon's Dogma be not quite worthy of a best games period episode. Even though it had a cult following strong enough to both bring it to PC in 2016 and then also bring it to PlayStation 4 and Xbox One in 2017. And also, something I guess a lot of people don't know is that there was an incredibly popular follow-up to Dragon's Dogma Online, that released only in Japan. And it did really, really well. And I guess, unfortunately, it's free to play and just was never brought to the West, which kind of stinks. But, that's how it is. I was kind of hoping when Capcom announced a few years back there was a game called Deep Down that they revealed at E3, either 2015 or 2016. It was actually announced in 2013. Sorry, I did a little check. Deep Down eventually had nothing to do with Dragon's Dogma. It's its own unique thing, and I guess I haven't really heard much of it since its reveal, but it's kind of like a sci-fi fantasy bend to it, and it looked really interesting and something that I kind of wish Dragon's Dogma would be revived, because it has a unique bridge between kind of a modern gameplay sensibilities and retro game sensibilities that are really it exists in kind of this interesting little bubble of experimentation that both succeeded and fell short, and it's just this interesting thing that exists on its own. And that's really, I guess, all I have to say about Dragon's Dogma. It's a mixed bag, and when it released, it got 9s across the board, maybe a few 8s in there, but I think time has not been overly kind to Dragon's Dogma. It's still, if you play the game, the version that released on PC or the Xbox One or PlayStation 4 versions, it's still relatively pretty. There are a lot of unupdated textures and models in the game, but the music is really nice. The presentation, even though it's aged, is still exciting and interesting. And when the dragon comes down and tears your heart out, it's still unnerving and weird. And I think unnerving and weird might be the two best qualities and ways to describe Dragon's Dogma, because there are a lot of just weird, unnerving, and different fights, but they're takes on these classic RPG monsters. And that's kind of what makes the entire game interesting, just seeing what it's going to throw at you next and how you're even going to be able to tackle it. And so it's not one of the best games, period. It's definitely not. And I think over time it will probably maybe even continue slipping away, but slipping farther and farther away. But I think there's a reason that people to this day still love Dragon's Dogma. And I think it's worth checking out, especially if you see it on sale on Steam or PSN or Xbox Live. It's interesting, and it's worth putting the time into to kind of experience the world of Dragon's Dogma and kind of seeing that journey through to the end. I found it to be really rewarding when the game came out. I found it really rewarding to play through again when it re-released, and I think it's worth talking about and worth remembering for all of the weird, goony design decisions and things that might have been done differently if it were made now, but I'm glad they are what they are, because they are interesting and unique in the world of video games. So check out Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen, which is the expanded version that includes the It includes an improved fast travel system, which I'm not sure if I recommend fast traveling in Dragon's Dogma. There is kind of a... It does get irritating towards the end of the game, but there's something to be said to just exploring on foot and putting in the time to travel places. It makes the world feel large and impressive and cool when you have to walk/run everywhere, and you have to, make the harrowing journeys that all the NPCs have to make. So, yeah, that's all I gotta say. So I'm gonna wrap this up. It's a shorty McDoherty today. So, thank you all so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to listen to me yammer on about Dragon's Dogma. And if you have time to do that, maybe you also have time to check out Extra Life, which is this amazing charity. It's part of Children's Miracle Network Hospitals, and it's basically just this organization, and people get together and they play video games or board games or outdoor games, any kind of game, and they raise money for sick and injured kids all across the United States and Canada. It's really amazing. You can learn more over on extra-life.org. You can also find this podcast over on the community side of things on community.extra-life.org. And over there you can find a bunch of different cool articles about video game news, board game news. You can find stuff about your local people in your area who are participating in Extra Life and who might very well appreciate your help if you want to lend a hand in local events or conventions. And all of that being said, you can also find this very podcast on iTunes, where we would appreciate a review if you want to leave us one of those. You can also find us on SoundCloud. We have a hosting site called Libsyn, and that's where we post up all our episodes, and they kind of get disseminated from there. We also have a YouTube page, which the podcast gets uploaded there. So if for some reason you want to watch an episode of this podcast, you can. Once upon a time, we did record video to kind of put alongside with the with the audio podcast, but that ended up being a lot of work and it lengthened the turnaround time to quite a bit, so we don't do that as much anymore. But there are quite a number of episodes up on the YouTube that have kind of the visual aid to go along with what we're talking about. And we also have a Patreon, so if you want to contribute to this podcast, if you like listening and you want to kind of chip in a little bit to help us keep this show going and cover our expenses, because it's not free to run a podcast, you can head over to patreon.com/bestgames and throw us $1 per month, and we will be forever grateful. You'll get access to a few unique episodes. We have stuff on the Super Mario Brothers anime movie. We have stuff up there on Rhyme, a spoiler cast. We have a bunch of different podcasts about various video game movie adaptations. And those are all on Patreon for $1 per month. We would appreciate that quite a bit. So, yeah. I believe that's everything. Join us next Monday. We should have a great episode about Catherine with a very special guest, a very patient guest. And I'm really looking forward to recording that, and hopefully you all get to listen to that next Monday. With that, we'll see you on the Flippity Dippity.
Greetings, loved ones. Let's take a journey. All your travels, are they all what they seem? Look around you, then you may realize all the preachers are with their lies. And I might know of a future, but you still control the past. Only you know if you'll be together. Only you know if we shall last.
Tonight's the night. Let's live it up. Come party down. Drinking my cup. We're doing shots. Up in the club. Roof is on fire. Let's raise it up.
In the nightlight, do you still feel your pain? For all the valor you rated never came. If you were able, would you go change the past? To mend the faux pas with one last chance? And I might know of a future, but you still control the past. Only you know if you'll be together. 'Cause every night I will save your life, and every night I will be with you, and every night I still lie awake and I dream of an absolution. 'Cause every night I will make it right, and every night I will come to you, but every night it just stays the same in my dream of an absolution. In the nightlight, do you see what you dream? All your triumph and all you'll ever be. Look around you, then you may realize happiness lies trapped in misery. And who knows what of a future? We can all try to change the past. Only you know if you'll be together. 'Cause every night I will save your life, and every night I will be with you. 'Cause every night I still lay awake and I dream of an absolution. 'Cause every night I will make it right, and every night I will come to you, but every night it just stays the same in my dream of an absolution.
Introducing Bowflex, the ultimate ab solution. Do you want swimsuit ready abs? Stop waiting. Get the body you've been dreaming of with Bowflex. Don't just dream of an ab solution. Pick up the phone and order the Bowflex Total Gym today.